Today we'll be talking about African American theater. Other than the few opportunities for African American actors with companies like William Henry Brown's African Theater in the 1820s, there were very limited opportunities for those who wanted to pursue a life in the theater. Ira Aldridge, who is often called the first great American black actor, is said to have worked menial jobs at New York theaters while performing lead roles in Romeo and Juliet and Pizarro with a small Negro ensemble. But due to racial prejudice, he never played at major theaters in the United States, so he went to England in 1826 when he was 17 years old. He became enormously famous in Europe. He introduced psychological realism into his acting in the 1850s, long before his European counterparts did. He toured Europe, performing in over 40 roles, and was most famous in the Shakespearean role of Othello. He received honors from royalty of various European countries, but never returned to the United States to perform. In the U.S., it was still difficult for African Americans to work in the theater. Some plays were written for the abolishment of slavery, but they were few. By the 1840s, white comedians had taken the storytelling and other traditions of African Americans and turned it into minstrel shows. These shows caricatured blacks on southern plantations, using ballads, comic dialogue, dance, and eventually some farcical skits. These were very distorted images. The shows were originally done by white actors wearing blackface, but eventually also performed by African Americans. Though, of course, hated by African Americans, it was one of the few opportunities for black performers to be on stage. By adopting these stereotypes, such as the loyal uncle, the warm-hearted mammy, the lazy bones, black performers were strengthening the idea that the stereotypes were true to life. But that was what white audiences would pay to see them do. Blackface was used by both black and white performers throughout the 1920s and beyond. Between 1890 and 1915, a few musicals were being written for black casts. Plays about African Americans were written, mostly by white people, but black writers began to emerge, and Harlem became a center for African American art. 1917 to 1929 was the Harlem Renaissance, a period of rebirth for African American theater. White people came to Harlem at night to go to cabaret shows and nightclubs. Books were written about African Americans. Jazz swept the nation. Dances such as the Charleston, the Black Bottom, and the Lindy Hop became all the rage. The 1920s was a period when African American culture was in vogue, and white patrons supported black artists. Whether or not it was for the right reasons, it gave the African American community support for their arts. In this era, Willis Richardson's The Chip Woman's Fortune was the first non-musical African American play on Broadway. The national economy crashed in 1929, and during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the U.S. government created the Works Progress Administration, which was a program to provide jobs for people. As part of this, the Federal Theater Project was begun in 1935. At the time, more than half of theater professionals were unemployed, and 2/3 of the legitimate theaters in New York were closed. Hallie Flanagan, the woman in charge of the Federal Theater Project, saw this as an opportunity to create a type of national theater with 5 regional centers and numerous sub-branches that would encourage experimentation in writing and staging. Through the Federal Theater Project, though the Federal Theater Project only existed for 4 years, it produced or financed over 1,000 productions and employed over 1,200 people. The Negro People's Theater was a unit of the Federal Theater Project. It was housed in the Lafayette Theater in Harlem. Here, Orson Welles, a famous actor and director, staged an all-black version of Shakespeare's tragedy, Macbeth, set in Haiti, and the 3 witches were voodoo doctors. It was one of the most successful shows of the Federal Theater Project. Negro units were established in 22 cities and together presented 75 plays. Some, like the Macbeth production, became world famous, and several original plays were works by Black writers that the Federal Theatre Project encouraged. Only a few Black actors from this time period won true fame. Paul Robeson was one of these. Born in New Jersey and educated at Rutgers and Columbia, where he got his law degree, he chose instead the life of a Black singer and actor. He made many appearances on Broadway, including in All God's Children Got Wings in 1924, where he played a Black lawyer who marries a white woman, and as the lead in Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones in 1925. He also played a part that was written for him in Showboat, where he sang Old Man River. His greatest success was as Othello in 1943. He led a lifelong protest against oppression and racial discrimination. Two African American playwrights gained recognition before the Civil Rights Movement, James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry was from a middle-class family in Chicago, but surrounded by poverty. Her play, A Raisin in the Sun, in 1959, deals with the dreams and setbacks of a Black family that face racism with integrity and pride. It deals with themes that have continued to influence writers: integration versus separation of races, American versus African values, having goals that are unique to African Americans, and equality versus discrimination. It was the first play on Broadway by a Black woman. It also had a Black director. It ran for 530 performances, winning the New York Drama Critics Circle Award. With the Civil Rights Movement and the Black National Movement of the 1960s came a change in the African American belief in the value of Blackness and all it entailed. Plays were being done that dealt with racial problems and usually had racially mixed casts. Slow social reform and the controversial Vietnam War triggered even more revolutionary dramas. The first big push toward an African American theater movement was the founding of the Black Arts Repertoire Theater in New York in 1964 by Leroy Jones and many others. By 1968, there were around 40 such groups across the country. Leroy Jones completely rejected white culture and changed his name to Amiri Baraka. He wrote plays like The Slave, which tells the story of a Black man who visits the home of his white ex-wife and her new husband, who is white. Baraka points up the Black man's low status in American society, but also stresses that he's victimized and enslaved by his own hatred and thus unable to effect social change. Another play, Dutchman, deals with a young Black man accosted on the subway by a white woman who eventually kills him. Baraka moved to New Jersey to found Spirit House, where he wanted to create a Black arts movement completely free of any white influence. This served as a model for other groups, but lost its momentum in the 1970s, when separatism became less important than the focus on the variety of perspectives within the African American experience. Ntozake Shange was born in New Jersey. Her first play, For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, brought immediate acclaim when it premiered in 1976. The play is a choreo poem which tells 7 women's individual life experiences. Her 1978 play, Spell Number 7, explores the oppressive repercussions of the blackface minstrel tradition. She has a very distinctive voice, creating her own spelling and grammar in defiance of the white language that excludes her experiences, and you can see her use of the language here. Another woman playwright, Adrienne Kennedy, blends symbols, historical figures, racial images, and myths to create surreal, highly personalized one-act plays which she claims are autobiographical. One of her most famous plays, Funny House of a Negro, which received a 1964 Obie Award, depicts the final moments before the suicide of a mulatto woman unable to reconcile herself to her mixed heritage. The National Black Theatre was founded by actress and director Barbara Ann Teer in 1968 as a temple of liberation. At first, they met to educate and spiritually enlighten the people it served. Early performances took the form of rituals based on the Black experience and developed in training workshops. By the late 1970s, more standard plays were being produced. Their original old building in Harlem burned in 1983, but they continued producing plays while rebuilding. In 1990, a new $10 million home was opened with a 288-seat theater. George C. Wolfe is a Tony Award-winning theatrical director, producer, playwright, and author. He first came to Broadway in 1991 with his production about Jelly Roll Morton. He also directed Angels in America on Broadway. In 1990, he directed Brecht's The Caucasian Chalk Circle, setting it in Haiti, and was selected as one of the 3 resident directors of the New York Shakespeare Festival, where he continued to work as a producer. He's openly gay, and when he was asked about being both gay and African American, he responded, "I encompass and embrace all my complexities, and depending on what the landscape is, what the obstacle is, I may wave one banner more intensely in one arena than I do in another, simply because of the war that's being fought." In 2009, he accepted a position as Chief Creative Officer for a museum called the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and continues to direct for film and live theater today. August Wilson is a half-white, half-black award-winning playwright who grew up in the low-income area of Pittsburgh and identified more with being Black. He wrote a series of plays that cover a century of life in the African American experience, each play depicting a different decade. By writing about Black history, he reclaimed it as African American, not something made up by a white historian, and by taking one's own history and accepting it, a person creates a future with more awareness and potential for change. Wilson's appeal has gone beyond Black audiences to a broad-based, multi-ethnic audience. In the 1990s, he was called the richest theatrical voice in the U.S. of the past decade. His play, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, was published in 1988 and is set in Pittsburgh in 1911. This was 46 years after the end of the Civil War abolishing slavery. Because of the enormous toll of the Civil War, it took decades to rebuild the country, and in some ways, change was slow. The dynamics reflected in this play demonstrate that. In our discussion question for this unit, I'll be asking you to discuss your understanding of the social dynamics and the world inhabited by these